Good morning, and welcome to the Des Moines Church of Christ. Whether you're one of our members or you're tuning in from somewhere else in the world, we're really glad that you're here with us. I've been encouraged. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen well over 1,000 people viewing these sermons. I'm so glad to hear they've been of inspiration to so many people, and I hope today's message is of inspiration to you as well. So here in the Des Moines Church, we've been doing a series that we've called Love One Another, where we've been focusing on our one another relationships and how we can strengthen them so the church can be strong to reach out and serve and save the world around us. But we've interrupted that series for just a little while here because we want to focus on the incredible challenge that all of us are facing. Unquestionably, we're facing uncertain times. I put that slide up last week as we started the sermon, introducing this little mini-series and talking about the uncertain times that we would be facing ahead in this last week. Well, we look back on the last week and we go, yep, there was a lot of uncertainty. A lot of crazy things happened in the last week. And as we look ahead to this next week, I can promise you, uncertain times still lie ahead. We have uncertainty physically, uncertainty economically, uncertainty relationally, and uncertainty even, unfortunately, spiritually. So we're facing all this uncertainty, and we're asking ourselves this question: how do we find strength in uncertain times? Last week, we looked at part 1 in this little mini-series, and we focused on David. If you missed that lesson, you can go to the Des Moines Church of Christ YouTube page, and you can listen to that lesson and all the lessons that we're doing. My wife has a bunch of cool lessons she's been doing for the women for midweek, as well as these Sunday sermons, and I hope you can get some inspiration from those. But last week, we focused on David, and we looked at how David was facing an incredibly uncertain, challenging time. And we looked at how he found strength, and specifically, you remember the passage there, 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, but David found strength in the Lord his God. Everyone else was going crazy, but David found strength in the Lord his God. And I hope this last week you've been able to do that. Well, now we're going to turn to part 2 in this mini-series, Finding Strength in Uncertain Times. And as I promised last week, we're going to look at a New Testament example. One of my favorite stories, again, of someone who faced an incredibly difficult time. A normal dude, just like you, just like me, that found himself thrust into a situation that he did not expect at all. And so we can look at him just like we looked at David and see, well, what did he do? How did he prevail during this incredibly problematic time? And maybe we can imitate his example and we can prevail as well. So we're going to look here at the Apostle Paul and read about this circumstance in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 8. He says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death." Dang. Okay, Paul was facing an incredibly challenging time. And so he wanted people to know, he's like, hey, I don't want you to think that everything's smooth sailing in the life of an apostle. When we were over in the province of Asia, man, it was tough. And you look at the words he uses to describe it there, he's like, we were under great pressure. Not just pressure, but great pressure. And not just great pressure, but under great pressure. Like it's just like a big rock just laying across our backs. And he goes, it wasn't just beyond our ability to endure. It was far beyond our ability to endure. But that didn't express it enough as well. He says, so that we despaired even of life. And then he goes, that's not enough. I need to explain it more. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. We felt like we'd received the death sentence. We're on death row. Man, Paul was facing a difficult time, and he described it here as he went to the province of Asia. Now, when I read this passage, I gotta be honest, I immediately relate to it Because I think about my time when my wife and I, when our family lived over in Asia, and we went over there to serve in the ministry and help spread the word. Now, it's a different Asia, I understand, okay? This is Asia Minor. It's a province, like a region, much like Galatia or Macedonia in the New Testament times, in the Roman world there. It's about the same size as those other regions. But when we went over to Asia, okay, different Asia, Far East, we loved so much about it. Loved the people, loved the opportunity, loved the language, the culture, the food, so many incredible memories. But oftentimes people would say, oh man, was it just so fun? Was it just so exciting? And I would feel like, Paul, hey, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. And I feel these exact same things, okay? Not quite as glorious and romantic as Paul's challenges, but man, we faced some incredible challenges. We faced challenges physically. Man, disease. I spent more days in the hospital in Asia in those several years we were there than in the whole rest of my life combined. Disease. Death threats. I got multiple serious death threats. I remember calling up my boss, okay, in another country and saying, hey, bro, man, I'm getting these death threats and they're really serious. Even the police listen to them and they go, yeah, it sounds really serious. And then I was expecting some kind of consolation or encouragement. He goes, well, you know what, bro? All of us got to go at some time. I'm like, what? That wasn't any encouragement to me. He since apologized, okay, years later. But anyway, that was a really difficult time. And then also physically, my wife had a C-section over there. Man, you have a C-section in Bangkok, okay? That's a pretty big deal. So we had all kinds of challenges physically. And then there were challenges environmentally. So there's physical pressures, environmental pressures. Gosh, the typhoons in Thailand and the Philippines, the floods. Man, I remember walking to church, holding my daughter on my shoulders with water up to here, no exaggeration, as we're just like basically swimming down the main city streets of downtown to get to our church building because of the incredible floods. There was all kinds of environmental challenges there, not to mention the rats, the mosquitoes, and the roaches and stuff like that. It's another story for another day. But we faced financial pressures. The first day we arrived, okay, like our welcome party at church, someone stole my wallet out of my briefcase. Very first day, welcome to Thailand, get his wallet. Somebody stole my wallet. I lost all my credit cards. I lost my traveler's checks, back when we used traveler's checks. And that was just like a foreshadowing of things to come. A few years later, we got our whole identity stolen. We went to withdraw some money from our bank account and it had been completely wiped out. Someone had intercepted a debit card and then just used it and wiped us completely out. Man, the financial pressures and the cultural pressures, just the cultural barriers, the culture shock, the language, the religion, the customs, there's just so much. So when Paul says we face pressures while we were in Asia, man, I can relate. We face pressures while we were in Asia. His were quite a bit worse, though. Let's just read an example. All right, now we don't know exactly what pressures he faced specifically while he was in that region of Asia Minor, but we do know later on in Corinthians, he's elaborated on some of the pressures he's faced thus far in his ministry. Let's read about some of those. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled, and I've often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Man, this is only halfway through Paul's life. There's another second half that came about after he wrote the letter to the Corinthians, and we don't know what kind of extra challenges there were, but you look at this guy and you go, yep, you were under great pressure. far beyond your ability to endure, so that you despaired even of life. We can see why you felt in your heart the sentence of death. He faced incredible pressure, incredibly challenging, uncertain times. But how would he respond? How would he respond to those uncertain times? Well, let's look back in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. We just read this where he says, we face these incredible pressures. But look at the verse that comes right after this in verse 10 through 11. But this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope, that he will continue to deliver us, as you help us by your prayers. Then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many. Wow, what a response. What an attitude. Again, we looked at David when he faced his challenges. It says he found strength in the Lord his God. Here, when Paul is facing these challenges, this one line, again, like that line from David, it not only describes how he responded to these challenges in Asia, but it describes how he responded to all the challenges in life that he faced. He says this, as I highlight it, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. He goes on to say, who raises the dead. This happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. Now that's really an interesting line if you stop and think about it. See, there's a lot of reasons that those challenges really happened. There's a lot of practical reasons. People beat him. People rejected him. People threw those stones at him. People chose to mistreat him. People chose to abandon him. He faced a lot of bad people who did a lot of bad things to him. And so there's a lot of reasons behind what they did, those actions. So he could have said, and you know what? All this happened because people are evil. Or he could have said, all this happened because people are selfish. Or all these challenges happen because people don't believe in God. He could have said so many things about why these things happened, but he didn't do that. Paul chose not to focus on the physical hardships and the causes behind those, as those would leave him feeling victimized. Instead, he focused on the spiritual opportunities that he was facing, as that would leave him feeling victorious. Okay, you catch that there? He chose not to focus on the physical hardships, as that would leave him feeling victimized. Instead, he chose to focus on the spiritual opportunity, as that would lead to him being victorious. So he says, this happened that I might learn to rely on God in a way that I never had before. See, he's looking at the spiritual opportunity, not the bad that was happening to him or had happened to him. Wow, what a great approach. It's so easy in our lives to focus on our wounds and our woes. And, there's a place for that. Paul shared about his wounds and his woes as we read later on. And there's times we need to just open up and share about the challenges we're facing. I get that. I understand that. But it's so easy to focus on that and then just stay focused on that. See, it's good to share about those things occasionally, but you can't stay there. You can't stay there focusing on your wounds and your woes forever. It's a one-way street that leads to a dead end. There's nothing good that comes about when you remain in a victimized state of focusing on your wounds and your woes. And so that's why Paul, rather than focusing on those hardships, focused on the spiritual opportunity that was created because of those hardships, to the point that he could say, and you know what? All that bad happened so that I could learn this lesson. Man, what a positive spiritual way to turn that around. It's funny, when I look back at my time in Asia, if you ask people that know me, or, sermons that I've given, and you say, what's the greatest benefit you got from Asia? I'm going to say, it's the lessons I learned about faith. Because when everything else is stripped away, when you're lying in the hospital room, when you're facing those death threats, when you're walking through flooded waters, like when you're flat on your back and you go, I do not know what to do, but my eyes are on you. Man, that's when you have the opportunity to learn to rely on God in a deeper way. You can never learn about that from a textbook. You can never learn about that just from a sermon. You can only learn how to rely on God and dig deeper in your faith by being flat on your back and having no other recourse except God to turn to. And that's exactly what Paul did. And so he mentions, as he talks about this relying on God, he goes on to describe and mention two different ways that he relied on God. And it's kind of a cool little insight. Now, there's many different ways. If you read through his letters, there's many different ways he relied on God. But here he mentions two that are very practical and really helpful. Okay, let me highlight these. The first one he talks about is hope. He says, on him, on God, we have set our hope. On him, we have set our hope. I like that word, set. He doesn't just say we hope, but he says we've set our hope. It's a deliberate, intentional action. It was a conscious decision. Okay, I am setting my hope on him. Like you set a goal, or you set sail, or you set your mind, or you set your sights. There's so many ways that we use this word to set something. Here he says, we've set our hope on him. I like that. A deliberate decision. He didn't set his hope on just positive wishful thinking. He didn't set his hope on other people. He didn't set his hope on his own ability. He didn't set his hope on what the government would provide, though all those things can be really good and there's a place for all those things. But he knew when the chips were down, he knew that none of those other things could really make the difference. So when you're facing really uncertain times, where there's real uncertainty like he was here, he knew the only recourse was to set his hope on God, who raises the dead. And what a cool qualifying phrase to remind you of the strength of God. It's hard to summarize the strength of God in any better way than that. God who raises the dead. You just kind of go, oh yeah, he can do anything. He can take something that's dead and bring it back to life. He can turn anything around. He's the only one worthy of truly setting your hope on. So I love that. And the same is true with us. This is a time, we're facing an uncertain time that we need to set our hope on God, not on so many other things, not on our government, not on our people, not on our 401k, not on our jobs. Like those things, okay, they're good. We can have some hope for those things. But ultimately, this is a time that we need to learn to set our hope on God like we've never done before. So that we could even have the attitude of Paul that this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Now, I know practically this happened because, this guy over there in Wuhan, he contracts this sickness from this bat, turns into this virus. I get all that. But the spiritual opportunity, rather than the victim thinking, says, but this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. Let's set our hope on God. Don't set your hope on anything else. Nothing else can raise the dead. The present challenges that we're facing, they will subside at some point. But if we're more focused on the challenges before us than on the Father above us, we're going to become victims and not victors. You catch that? If we're more focused on the challenges before us than on the Father above us, we're going to become victims and not victors. Don't be a victim. Be a victor. Set your hope on God. The second area that he mentions back in our passage here is he mentions prayer. Twice he says it. He says, God will deliver us as you help us by your prayers. And at the end, he'll give us this favor in answer to the prayers of many. He talks about prayer when he's talking about relying on God. And indeed, is there any other action that says, I rely on God more than prayer? Prayer really is the greatest expression of relying on God. Prayer is the greatest expression of relying on God, is a constant theme of Paul. In his letters, he mentions prayer in some way, shape, or form about 60 different times. Just in his several letters, 60 different times, he relied on God through prayer. Prayer is the greatest expression of relying on God. If you're relying on God, you're praying. If you're praying, you're relying on God. Likewise, if you're not relying on God, you're not praying. And if you're not praying, you're not relying on God. Prayer is the greatest expression of relying on God. Paul said he prayed for others in his letters. He said, I prayed for you. And he gave specific things he was praying for. I pray this for you. I pray this for you. He said that he prayed for them 25 different times in his letters. He was constantly praying very specific things for each of the churches and relationships that he had. But then also, he asks for prayers from those people 13 different times. 13 different times. He's like, could you pray for me for this? Could you pray this for me? Could you pray this for me? I need your help. Could you pray for me? He asked that they would help him by praying for him. So he prayed for others and he asked for prayers in return. Now this goes back to our series, our Love One Another series. I said last week that we would look at an inspirational example again this week, but then segue back into our series. And we're going to do that in just a second here. We're going to do that again next week with the individual that we looked at and the challenges that he was facing. But here we segue into our series with this passage. Pray for one another. James 5:16. Pray for one another. It's one of the appeals, one of the commands that God gives us, to pray for one another. What a great way to rely on God during this challenging time, to pray for one another. But also, what a great way to love one another during this challenging time, by praying for one another. Pray for one another. This really is a great thing to be doing right now. Gosh, we got extra time. Many of us have extra time to text around and say, hey, I'm praying this for you. Hey, what can I pray for you? And just to be exchanging these prayer times, or pray together online, or pray together via Zoom or text or something like that. Man, just to be praying together and praying for one another. What better way to rely on God? So from David, we learn to find strength in God from the Psalms. From Paul, we learn how to rely on God through setting our hope in Him and saying our prayers. So the appeal I want to make to you today is to imitate Paul. To find strength in these uncertain times, imitate the way he did it. Set your hope. Just right now, as we're going to take communion in a second, what a great time to just literally look at hope in God and go, okay, I'm setting, or look at hope, and go, I'm setting it on God. When you think about what you want to take place, when you think about the good you want to come out of all of this, when you think about the hope ahead that you have for yourself, your family, your church, your country, take that hope and set it on God. Because He raises the dead. Before you go to bed at night, set your hope on God. When you wake up in the morning, set your hope on God. Set your hope on God. And then imitate Him by, say your prayers. Say your prayers again. Let's be praying for one another throughout the day. Just praying, lifting up each other. What a great way to show God we're relying on Him. And what a great way to love one another by praying for one another. Set your hope. Say your prayers. Let's rely on God, and we'll truly find strength in these uncertain times. Let's pray together as we take communion. Our Father in heaven, we thank You for being our rock, for being our refuge, for being our shield, for being our horn, for being our strength against the foe. You're the only one that ultimately we can trust in and rely on. We look around and so many of the challenges we're facing, they baffle our scientists. They baffle our economists. They confuse us, and there's just so much uncertainty in it. At times we know we don't have the answers and we don't know how to go on. Father, help us to imitate Paul and to look up to you, to rely on you during these times like we never have before, and to learn this lesson during this time to where we can look back in years ahead and say, wow, what benefit we got from those challenging times, because that's when our reliance on God got greater than ever. Father, help us to do that. Help us to rely on you. Help us to set our hope in you, and help us to truly pray to you, heart and soul, with all of our faith and faithfulness, day in and day out. Thank you for Jesus being such a great example as well of relying on you. Truly, you raised him from the dead. We remember the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus as we take the communion, and we find great encouragement, great security, and great strength, just knowing you're the God who raises the dead. As we take this bread that symbolizes Jesus' body, this juice that symbolizes his blood, I pray we can set our hope on you, the great resurrector. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless you. See you next week.